The dinner table looked the same as it always had. Polished wood, familiar plates, voices overlapping in casual rhythm. But Lena felt the difference the moment she sat down. Years of distance had sharpened her awareness. And every glance, every pause carried meaning now. She listened more than she spoke, watching how attention shifted effortlessly toward others, how concern was distributed unevenly, as if by habit rather than intention. When the conversation drifted into safe territory, she waited. Her voice, when it finally entered the room, was calm and unremarkable, almost careless. She asked if anyone had picked up her prescription, mentioning that the doctor had said it was urgent. The words were simple, nearly invisible, yet the silence that followed exposed more than any argument ever could. No one answered immediately. A fork scraped against a plate. Someone cleared their throat. The delay was small, almost polite, but Lena felt its weight press against her chest. She had not raised her voice or accused anyone. She had not reminded them how she had mentioned it earlier, or how important it was. She simply asked. That was the point. The question wasn't meant to provoke. It was meant to reveal. In that pause, Lena saw the truth she had spent years denying. Urgency, when it belonged to her, had never truly mattered. As explanations surfaced, they came tangled in defensiveness and distraction. Someone thought someone else was handling it. Someone forgot. Someone assumed it could wait. Each response carried an undertone of inconvenience, as though her need had interrupted something more important. Lena nodded, her expression neutral, but inside she felt a strange calm. This was not disappointment. It was confirmation. The realization settled quietly, like a final piece clicking into place. She remembered how often this pattern had repeated itself throughout her life. Promises delayed, needs minimized, responsibility quietly shifted away from her. Back then, she had explained it away, convinced herself she was asking too much. That understanding meant patience. That love meant endurance. Sitting at the table now, older and no longer desperate for approval, she recognized the cost of that belief. This moment was not about medicine. It was about presence, about whether care was instinctive or optional. No one noticed the change in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed instead of tensing. Lena didn't argue or remind them of the consequences. She didn't express hurt. She simply absorbed the moment for what it was. The power lay in her silence, in her refusal to rescue the situation emotionally. For the first time, she did not make excuses on their behalf or soften the truth to preserve harmony. She allowed the discomfort to exist, untouched. Around her, conversation slowly resumed. But something had shifted. The air felt heavier, not because Lena had done anything dramatic, but because the truth had surfaced without drama at all. She realized that she had spent years believing care had to be requested, justified, negotiated. This small question proved otherwise. Genuine concern doesn't need reminders. It responds instinctively. What she had mistaken for love had often been obligation, and even that was inconsistently applied. Lena felt no urge to correct the situation or fix the oversight. She knew she would handle the prescription herself, just as she always had. The difference was that she no longer felt invisible while doing so. She saw the dynamic clearly now, stripped of nostalgia and hope. This clarity didn't hurt the way truth once had. It steadied her. It told her exactly where she stood and what she could stop expecting. As the dinner ended, Lena understood that this moment marked a quiet turning point. Not a confrontation, not a rupture, but a recognition. She had asked a casual question and received an honest answer without words. It showed her that care could not be forced, and loyalty could not be demanded. The strength she felt wasn't anger or bitterness, but certainty. She no longer needed to test them again. The test had already given her everything she needed to know. Lena's life began to change the moment she put physical distance between herself and the family environment that had quietly shaped her sense of worth. Leaving was not dramatic or loud. It happened gradually, through missed gatherings, unanswered calls, and a growing comfort with silence. At first, the separation felt unnatural, almost wrong, as if she were breaking an unspoken rule that demanded constant availability. Guilt followed her into this new space, whispering that distance meant abandonment, that independence was selfish. Yet as time passed, those voices grew quieter, replaced by something unfamiliar but steady. Clarity, without the constant background noise of judgment and expectation. Lena started to notice who she was when no one was watching. Her thoughts felt less crowded. Decisions no longer required rehearsed explanations. She learned how much energy she had been spending managing other people's emotions, predicting reactions, and adjusting herself to fit invisible standards. In the absence of that pressure, her mind finally had room to breathe. Distance did not erase the past, but it changed her relationship to it. Memories that once triggered shame began to look different when viewed from afar. Stripped of immediate emotional threat, living away from her family forced Lena to rely on herself in ways she never had before. There was no one to call for reassurance or validation. No familiar structure to fall back on. What initially felt like loneliness slowly transformed into self-trust. She handled her own problems, made mistakes without witnesses, and learned that failure did not automatically make her unworthy. Each challenge she faced alone reinforced a quiet confidence that had been absent for most of her life. Independence was no longer an abstract idea. It became lived experience. The most significant change, however, was internal. Away from constant comparison and favoritism, Lena stopped measuring her value against others. She recognized how often she had been positioned as secondary, expected to accommodate rather than be accommodated. Distance revealed how deeply those roles had been embedded in her identity. With space, she could finally question them. She asked herself what she wanted, not what was expected of her, and the answers surprised her. They were simpler and more honest than she had imagined. As weeks turned into months, Lena noticed how her body responded to this new life. Tension she hadn't realized she carried began to ease. She slept better. Her reactions softened. Even her voice changed, steadier and more assured. The absence of constant emotional vigilance allowed her nervous system to settle. Peace, she realized, wasn't something she had to earn through endurance. It was something that emerged naturally when she stopped placing herself in environments that required self-erasure. Distance also sharpened her perception of her family's behavior. Without being immersed in it daily, patterns became obvious. Conversations replayed themselves in her mind with new clarity. Moments she once dismissed as misunderstandings revealed consistent themes of control and dismissal. This awareness did not fill her with resentment. It grounded her. She no longer needed to argue with her past or defend her feelings. Understanding replaced confusion. Lena did not return to her family as the same person when she re-entered their space. Even briefly, she felt anchored in herself. Their reactions no longer dictated her mood. She listened without absorbing, observed without internalizing. The distance had given her a stable center, one that did not collapse under scrutiny or expectation. She realized that closeness without respect had cost her too much, and distance had given back what she didn't know she had lost. By stepping away, Lena didn't lose herself. She found herself. Separation became a form of self-reconstruction, a necessary pause that allowed her to shed roles that no longer fit. In choosing distance, she reclaimed authorship over her own life. The clarity she gained wasn't loud or triumphant, but it was enduring. It reshaped how she moved through the world, no longer defined by who she was to others, but by who she had learned to be on her own. For years, the imbalance within Lena's family had existed without being named. It was woven into everyday interactions, disguised as normalcy, protected by habit and silence. Certain voices were always heard first. Certain mistakes were forgiven without question. Others were expected to adjust, to be patient, to understand. Lena had grown up sensing this unevenness, but lacked the language to challenge it. Instead, she learned to adapt, believing that harmony required her to remain quiet and accommodating. The favoritism was never announced. It thrived precisely because it was unspoken. Silence played a crucial role in keeping the structure intact. Moments of unfairness passed without comment. absorbed into the rhythm of family life. When discomfort surfaced, it was smoothed over with jokes, excuses, or reminders of shared history. Lena learned early that naming the problem would only create tension, and tension was treated as a greater threat than injustice. Over time, this silence became a form of agreement, not because everyone believed in the system, but because confronting it felt more dangerous than enduring it. The collapse began not with confrontation, but with absence. As Lena stepped back and stopped participating in the familiar cycle, the roles she once filled were left exposed. Her willingness to absorb emotional weight had quietly supported the entire structure. Without her presence to buffer discomfort or excuse behavior, small cracks began to appear. Responsibilities went unmet. Assumptions were challenged by reality. The family dynamic, long dependent on her compliance, started to feel unstable. When Lena finally re-entered the family space, the imbalance was harder to hide. Her changed demeanor disrupted the old patterns. She listened without rushing to fix things. She declined to smooth over awkward moments. This refusal to perform emotional labor unsettled everyone more than open conflict ever had. The favoritism, once masked by her silence, became visible in contrast to her restraint. Reactions that once seemed subtle now stood out clearly, exposed by the absence of her complicity. Discomfort spread through the family, not because Lena accused anyone, but because the system no longer worked as intended. Conversations stalled where they once flowed. Expectations went unmet. The silence that had protected favoritism turned against it, amplifying what had been hidden. Family members struggled to explain the tension, often framing it as Lena being distant or changed. Yet the real change was not her withdrawal, but the sudden lack of emotional cushioning that had kept imbalance from being felt. For the first time, the consequences of long-term favoritism became unavoidable. The individuals who had benefited from it were faced with confusion and frustration, unsure why relationships felt strained. Those who had relied on Lena's understanding and forgiveness found themselves without it. The emotional economy of the family shifted, revealing how much had been taken for granted. What once seemed sustainable now felt fragile. Lena observed all of this with a calm she didn't recognize in herself before. She felt no urge to defend or explain her position. The clarity she had gained through distance allowed her to see that the discomfort unfolding around her was not something she needed to resolve. It belonged to the system that had ignored imbalance for years. By refusing to carry it any longer, she allowed its weight to be felt where it originated. The silence that followed was different from the one that came before. It was no longer protective or enabling. It was heavy with recognition. Lena understood that collapse did not always look like chaos or confrontation. Sometimes it looked like truth becoming impossible to ignore. The favoritism that had survived through avoidance could not survive exposure. Without raising her voice or demanding accountability, Lena had stepped out of the role that sustained it, and in doing so, allowed the family's long-standing imbalance to finally stand on its own. The apologies came later, after the tension had settled into something uncomfortable and undeniable. They did not arrive quietly or privately, but in moments where witnesses were present, where words could be shaped to appear generous without requiring real accountability. Lena recognized the pattern immediately. The tone was soft, the expressions carefully arranged, yet the substance felt hollow. These apologies were less about understanding harm and more about restoring balance, about easing discomfort without disturbing the roles that had caused it. Each apology carried a familiar structure. Regret was expressed in vague terms, detached from specific actions. Responsibility was diluted with explanations, framed as misunderstandings rather than choices. There was an unspoken expectation that Lena would respond with forgiveness, that she would reassure everyone that things were fine, that harmony could be restored if she played her part. In the past, she would have done exactly that, believing that accepting the apology was the mature and loving response. This time, she heard what was missing. What troubled Lena most was not the words themselves, but what followed them. Almost immediately, the narrative began to shift. Discomfort was reframed as overreaction. Boundaries were described as distance. Her silence was interpreted as cruelty. Subtle cues suggested that the real problem was not the harm done, but her refusal to move past it quickly. The apology became a shield, protecting the behavior it was supposedly addressing. By offering it publicly, the burden was quietly transferred onto her. If she did not accept it, she became the obstacle. Lena felt the familiar pull to explain herself, to clarify her intentions, to prove that she was not being unreasonable. But she had learned to recognize this impulse as part of the same cycle that had kept her trapped for years. Explaining invited debate, justifying invited dismissal. She understood now that not every apology deserved engagement, and not every expression of regret signaled change. Some were simply tools designed to preserve comfort. Her refusal was not dramatic. She did not argue or accuse. She simply did not step into the role that had been assigned to her. She did not offer reassurance or absolution. She allowed the apology to exist without validating it. This quiet resistance disrupted the dynamic more than anger ever could. Without her cooperation, the performance lost its effect. The room felt uneasy, stripped of its usual resolution. What followed revealed the true purpose of the apology. Frustration surfaced. Tone shifted. Patience thinned. The expectation of forgiveness hardened into entitlement. In those moments, Lena saw clearly that the apology had been conditional, dependent on her compliance. When she did not provide it, the mask slipped. Blame, once subtle, became more direct. The narrative turned toward how her reaction was hurting others, how her silence was causing division. Instead of internalizing this blame, Lena remained steady. She understood that her refusal was not an act of punishment, but of self-respect. She was no longer willing to absorb guilt to protect someone else's image. This choice felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, yet it carried a deep sense of alignment. For the first time, her actions reflected her internal truth. By rejecting apologies that protected the abuser rather than addressing the harm, Lena stepped out of a long-standing emotional contract. She no longer accepted words that asked her to erase her experience in exchange for peace. The strength in her refusal lay not in confrontation, but in clarity. She allowed consequences to exist without interference. This moment marked a decisive shift. Lena realized that healing did not require her participation in false resolutions. By choosing not to engage with manipulative apologies, she reclaimed her agency. The discomfort that followed was not a sign of failure, but evidence that the dynamic had changed. She had stopped performing forgiveness on demand, and in doing so, drew a line that could not be crossed without honesty. Lena's understanding of loyalty had been shaped by years of quiet sacrifice. She had learned to equate love with endurance, to believe that staying meant proving devotion, even when staying required her to diminish herself. Walking away had once felt like betrayal, a violation of everything she had been taught about family. Yet as time passed, she began to see that the loyalty she had offered was never truly reciprocal. It had been expected, not cherished, assumed rather than earned. Recognizing this truth did not harden her. It clarified her choices. Marisol played a steady role in this transformation, not by offering dramatic advice, but through presence and consistency. Their conversations were calm and unforced, grounded in mutual respect. Marisol did not rush Lena toward reconciliation or frame separation as failure. Instead, she reflected back what Lena was already discovering on her own, that healthy relationships do not require self-abandonment. Through this connection, Lena experienced a different model of care, one that did not demand performance or emotional payment. Choosing peace required Lena to redefine strength. It was not found in enduring discomfort silently or absorbing harm with grace. It emerged in her willingness to let go of the need to be understood by those unwilling to listen. She stopped measuring her worth by how much she could tolerate. This shift was subtle but profound. It changed how she moved through the world, how she responded to conflict, how she valued her own emotional limits. Separation no longer felt like punishment, either for herself or for her family. It became a boundary, clear and intentional. Lena understood that some spaces could not hold the version of her she had become. Rather than shrinking to fit them, She chose to step back. This decision carried grief, but it also carried relief. She no longer felt responsible for maintaining connections that required constant self-negotiation. The absence of daily tension allowed Lena to cultivate a quieter life. Her thoughts felt more ordered, her emotions less reactive. She noticed how much energy she had once spent anticipating disappointment, preparing herself for neglect. Without that burden, she felt lighter, more present. Peace was not dramatic or celebratory. It was steady. It showed up in small moments of ease, in the absence of dread, in the freedom to choose how she spent her time and emotional energy. Lena's family continued to interpret her distance in ways that made sense to them. Some saw it as rejection, others as indifference. She no longer felt compelled to correct these interpretations. She understood that being misunderstood was sometimes the cost of being true to oneself. Her clarity did not depend on their agreement. This acceptance marked a significant turning point. She stopped trying to manage how her choices were perceived. What surprised Lena most was how little anger she felt. By choosing peace, she had released the need for revenge in its traditional form. There was no satisfaction in watching others struggle with the consequences of their actions. Her sense of justice came from alignment, from living a life that no longer revolved around old wounds. Freedom, she realized, was not loud. It did not require validation. It existed quietly, in the space she created for herself. With Marisol's steady presence and her own growing self-trust, Lena stepped into a future defined by autonomy rather than obligation. She learned that love rooted in respect does not demand sacrifice of self. Boundaries became acts of care, not walls of bitterness. In choosing separation over sacrifice, Lena reclaimed ownership of her life. The peace she found was not something taken from anyone else. It was something she finally allowed herself to keep.